work. Charles, if you could share your screen, please.
Yes, okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, that looks good. Okay, now we have Charles Law talking about chemical substructures and protoplanetary disks. Please go ahead.
All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share some of the results with you today. So I'm a graduate student at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, working with Karin Oberg. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is all within the MAPS collaboration. So this is the Molecules of ALMA at Planet Forming Scales, which is a cycle 6 ALMA large program led by Karin Oberg. And really all the work that I'm presenting today wouldn't have happened without the hard work of all the people that I'm listing here. It's 39 astronomers all across the world over the past 2 years to make this happen. In the fall, we put out the first set of MAPS papers, which was 20 papers in app.js. You can also find them on our website as well as a full data release, but there's still much more to do in this data. As you may suspect, I'm not going to be able to talk about all 20 of these. I'm just going to focus on one of the papers I led as part of this work, and that is focusing on the radial distribution of molecular line emission in these protoplanetary disks. Okay, so to just frame the program, we wanted to investigate the chemistry of planet formation. And the best way to do this was to have a comprehensive set of molecular lines. And when I say comprehensive, I mean 50 plus molecular lines were covered by the MAPS program, all at very high spatial resolutions, so 10, 20 AU. And what this allowed us to do is to get access to the chemistry of the inner planet forming regions in these disks, go down at 100 AU, 50 AU, really spatially resolve these regions and look at the chemistry going on here. As a result of these very highly sensitive and high angular resolution observations, we could also probe the radial and the vertical distribution of gas in these disks. Again, I'll be focusing mostly on the radial aspect today. Another thing that came out of this also to be able to assess the relationship between dust substructure and chemical substructure in these disks. Okay, so our sample were these 5 disks here. They're all relatively nearby, 100 to 160 parsecs around both T-Tauri and her big AE stars. So the top row here is showing the integrated intensity maps of the 12CO 2:1 transition. As you might notice, they're all very bright and very spatially extended, very large CO disks, and they were picked for these reason. We wanted bright disks that had bright molecular line emission to do this kind of deep survey. The inset here in gray is showing the region corresponding to the millimeter continuum that's on the bottom row. And another thing you might notice by looking at the continuum, this is the millimeter sized dust grains in the disk midplanes from which planets will be forming. You'll notice a diverse set of continuum substructure. So for instance, in IM loop, you see spiral arms in the dust. And in a disk like AS209, you see many very tight concentric rings. And so we picked, again, a very specific set of disks because we wanted to explore, is this variation in dust substructure causing any effects in the chemistry? And perhaps most importantly of all of these disks showed some evidence of ongoing planet formation, making them the really ideal candidates to study the chemistry of planet formation. We know that they're actually forming planets in the disks, so it's really probably the most helpful thing to know. Okay, so to jump into the disk radial structure. So why do we care about disk radial structures? So we know that the spatial distribution of gas and dust in these disks sets the composition of nascent planets. And thanks to some really tremendous observational results from ALMA, we know the dust has very highly structured at very small scale. So at 1 to 10 AU, we see ubiquitous substructure, lots of rings, gaps, in some cases spiral arms. And that's shown here in these really beautiful images to the right. But if we talk about the line observations, they have not been done at the same level of detail. They've been either limited to coarser spatial resolutions or have either focused on much smaller samples, either focusing on a single line like CO or a single disk. So the comprehensive picture of the chemistry of planet formation at a similar scale as the dust is really missing. And to illustrate that, I'm going to focus on one of these disks here. This is the one around HD 16296, and now compare the existing prior to MAPS continuum observations in the upper left to some of the common molecular gas tracers. So on the upper left, this is the continuum. The beam in the lower left is very small. We see lots of rings and gaps, very well resolved, very high signal to noise. But the same cannot be said for these molecular line tracers. So if we look C18O or N2H+ or formaldehyde, you notice a much larger beam, much poorer signal to noise. So if there were substructures, lots of rings and gaps at the same small scales as the continuum, we would effectively just be smearing them out because we have such a large beam. And so the real aim of maps was to do this in a more comprehensive way, to have much smaller beams, much higher sensitivity, and put the continuum and the gas on a much more equal footing and do it for a larger sample, do it for 5 disks and for many different lines. So let's jump straight to the results. So here to the right is a gallery of only a small section of our data. So this is probably about, this is 6 lines here, so out of the 50. So we have lots of data basically. Every row here is showing a different molecular line, and each column is showing a different disk. So I just picked a few representative tracers. But if you just glance at it quickly, the first thing and the most maybe striking thing you notice is lots of morphological variation, both among the disks and between the different lines. We see plentiful substructure at this resolution. We see many rings and gaps, emission plateaus. Then we find these at essentially all radii where we detect line emission. And in the case of the work that I led, which was MAPS 3, we focused on only 18 of the brightest lines for a detailed analysis of the radial substructure. And we found 200 plus features. So that means 200 plus rings and gaps and substructural features just across these 5 disks. So it is really ubiquitous. Just as much as the dust we were seeing, the gas is also very, very structured. So one way to look at this in a bit more detail is to take a cut along one of these axes here. And so we can pick one particular disk. Now we'll go back to our favorite disk, HD16296. And instead of looking at these 6 lines, let's look at all of the 18 that I had mentioned. So here is a full gallery of all of the moment 0 integrated intensity maps for these 18 lines. And again, this varied radial morphology is very clear. We like to say that their HD16296 has many molecular faces. Depending on which subset of tracers you look at here, you get a totally different disk. The CO looks very broad and smooth. Other lines like the C2H and HCN have very distinct multiple rings, whereas larger molecules like HC3N or methylcyanide have a very compact single ring towards the central star. But if you recall back to the image I showed before, pre-maps, if you look at the beams here, the molecular line emission data is now comparable to that of the continuum, to that of the dust in the lower right here. So now we can really put these for the first time on an equal footing. And to do that, what I did is went through and did a systematic analysis of all the radial substructures. So here I'm just labeling all of the rings or gaps or emission maxima or minima that were located in this data. So just in these 18 lines, in this one disk, we found more than 70 different substructures as labeled here. And so now this allows for this comparison to be done directly between the substructures we're seeing in the dust and the substructures that we're seeing in the gas. But that's a lot of substructures, seeing 70 just in one particular disk. So that begs the question, what are the origins of these chemical substructures? And these can broadly be categorized into 2 types. One could be chemical effects. So seeing things like changing ratios of the C to O, molecules freezing out onto dust grains, thermal desorption, and so on, various chemical effects driving these chemical substructures. Alternatively, we could have substructures created by physical structure. So we could have planet-disk interactions, we could have warps, interaction with the environment, or infall of gas. And as you might suspect, we have 200 features and 5 disks. We weren't able to go through and exhaustively identify the origin of every single individual feature, but rather we intended to establish empirical connections between the chemical substructures we were seeing and some potential physical and chemical origins. And we did this in mainly 2 ways. The first was to ask if we see spatial correlations between the line emission and the dust substructures, and then to ask the same question, but now with the mid-plane molecular snow line. So this is the location where we have major volatile species freezing out into the dust grains. So at this point, we expect chemical changes, and we might expect to see chemical substructures forming right around those snow lines. Okay, but so let's first talk about the dust. So the main idea for this, the first thing to do is to just make a plot. So what I'm showing here is for the HD16296 disk. On the y-axis here is all the different 18 molecular lines, and then the x-axis is the radius. What I'm showing is the different molecular substructures that we detected in the squares and the circles. And so on the background, we're showing the dust continuum. in the colors. So what you can see here is the dark lanes are the gaps and the bright lanes are the dust rings. And what we can ask is just, are we seeing spatial correspondences? Are we seeing the rings aligning with rings or gaps aligning with gaps, or is everything randomly distributed? And it doesn't look to be entirely randomly distributed. For instance, if we take this section here, we see a large set of gaps in the gas and gaps in the dust aligning, and the same thing for the ring. But that's not the only type of correspondences we see. We also see a case where we have lots of rings in the molecular monolithion aligning with a gap in the millimeter dust. So we did this comprehensively for all of the disks that we had. So just focusing on the nominal inner disk portion, so within 150 AU, we calculated the fraction of overlapping substructures for all of the disks for all possible types of correspondences. So we can have gaps and rings in the dust, and we can have gaps and rings in the gas. So that putting that together, we get 4 possible ways that these substructures could be overlapping. And just to guide your eye here, this is about 1/3 of features overlapping, and this is 50% of the features overlapping. And so you do notice in a few cases, we see over 50% of the features are aligning with each other, which suggests some sort of link between the dust and the gas. So particularly that's the case for geomorrhea and MWC480. And we should just note that many of these associations we see are independent of underlying substructure correlations in terms of gas density and the dust density. So for instance, only some of these dust gaps that we see are also obviously depleted in the gas. So it's not just all of the gas is missing at the places where the dust is missing, for instance. Also, you might suspect that this is just dust absorption that is always causing this and optical depth issues, but that doesn't explain the full diversity of these correlations that we're seeing. So it might explain some, but it doesn't explain everything that we see. And it doesn't also explain the lack of consistent associations we see, as we mentioned for HD16296, sometimes gaps and gaps, sometimes rings and gaps and in the same disk. So I just want to point out some really nice work that's been done by Haocheng Zhang, who I believe is going to talk later today, who went ahead and after we published the math paper, went and did a proper statistical analysis of this. We just did the first order thing, made these correspondences plots, but they went ahead and they went ahead and did the proper statistical analysis and found that there is not a statistically significant universal correlation between the dust and the gas. Only in a few cases, for a few of the disks and for a few types of alignments, did they find a statistically significant correlation, in particular for MWC480, where you had dust gaps aligning at chemical rings. But in general, this isn't a universal explanation. And so we can't appeal to dust interactions with the gas to cause all of these. It's playing a part in some cases, but it's definitely not explaining everything. So then let's consider the second case that I mentioned, the snow lines. So what we see here is for looking at the IM loop, AS29 and MWC480 disks. I'm plotting the locations of the CO snow line in shaded gray here and the N2 snow line in pink. And these are radial profiles of different types of molecules. So the blue at the top is formaldehyde, then nitriles in orange, the hydrocarbons in purple, and CO isotopologues in red. And what we can do, again, just the first order, is compare, do we see snow lines occurring at or near the location of substructures, or rings or gaps? And in the case of these 3 disks, the snow lines are almost always exclusively interior or exterior to substructures that we see. There doesn't seem to be much spatial overlap at all. But what about the other 2 disks? So if we look at geomorrhea and HD16296, the picture becomes a little more complicated. Now you might notice that there's 2 lines for each snow line. So the shaded region is that derived from thermochemical models, and the dashed line is derived from observations of N2H+. And the real problem here is that you notice that there's an uncertainty of, in some cases, a few tens of AU between the 2 measurements. And that uncertainty in the snow line location really makes it difficult to know if the spatial links that we're seeing here are real. So take geomorrhea, for instance. If you take the CO snow line from thermochemical models where it's shaded, that's always aligning with a ring in many of the molecular lines. But if you were to consider the dashed gray line, which come from the observations, that always aligns with a gap. So it's very hard to know which of those spatial links is true, or if really it's maybe somewhere in the middle between those and it's not aligning with any particular substructures in the molecular lines. Either way, snow lines aren't going to give us a universal explanation either, because as you saw, for 3 out of the 5 disks, they didn't seem to align in any way with the substructures we were seeing in the molecules. So the picture that's emerging is one of complexity. We actually really have to understand in detail each disk and each type of molecule. There's not just one size fits all explanation for all of these substructures we're seeing.
1 minute.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just end there. And really what MAPS has shown us is we have really ubiquitous chemical substructure. So a very wide range of radial locations, widths, contrasts, as you can see in this gallery here. It's really a really striking data. And what's come out of this is there's no single explanation for these chemical substructures, and we really have to delve into the details and understand the disk and the molecule you care about in lots of detail. And the big picture in terms of planet formation is that if you're a planet forming in these disks, you're going to be assembling in a very distinct chemical environment, depending on which disk you're in, and even the radius at which you're located inside of a disk. So if you're at 100 AU versus 200 AU, that chemical environment can be vastly different. And just last thing I want to note that with the data release, you can go ahead and download all of this data, from the raw data to all the images to all our scripts. So if you just go to this webpage here, if any of this interests you, go ahead and you can download it. Yeah, so I'll just leave the summary slide up and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. It's yeah, this large program is just amazing what comes out of it. I think just looking at these images already, really cool. I'll just, since I'm the chair, I'll just ask the first question because I'm really curious. I'm not sure if the resolution is good enough for this, or if you can even say something about it. But do you see any difference in how close, basically, to where you assume the star position is, how close the disk goes to the star depending on the molecule? Is there any difference, or they kind of all like take up the same? Because the most inner parts I still not really understand, right? How you get from accretion from the disk to the star actually. So is there any difference on how close the molecules trace the disk towards the star?
No, that's a good question. And I mean, except in the cases where we see obvious cavities or plateauing towards the central region, we can really only say we see that at maybe a 10 AU scale. So if you're asking 1 AU or under, no, we're not really sensitive to that. There is some methods where we can use kinematic information for the very bright lines, like the CO lines, to get down to an effective resolution of maybe 2 AU. But that is a slightly more indirect method. So we can't get within 1 AU, and unfortunately, we're not able to push that far. And alternative methods and instruments to ALMA might be the way to go to supplement this kind of information.
So long baselines and band 9 or 10.
That would help. That would certainly get us closer.
Nice. Okay. I think there's some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are some questions. So very nice results. A naive question: will the dust-gas substructure correlation also depend on the dust grain size?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So we, in the program, we only had band 3 and band 6 dust continuum. And in that case, the dust substructures look pretty consistent with each other. So in the sense that what we explored, that didn't change that much. But if you were to change the tracer, the particular dust grain you were looking at, if that changed the substructure, then yes, it would change what we'd consider correlations. But we sort of limited to the continuum that we actually observed as part of this program. But that is something to check.
Yeah,
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, one more, I think.
Okay, yeah. So there are a few more that they will be posted on Slack. So, but the one that I ask now, so was the alignment between substructures done by eye, or what type of algorithm was used? The disks are not too inclined, but were the scale heights considered when deciding the position of the substructures?
Okay, yeah. So first part of the question is that first order thing was to just sort of overplot them and then do a quick calculation considering their widths and if they fall within each other's widths. So take the width of one feature and say how many features fall within that region. So not exactly by eye, but not very sophisticated. I would point to the paper I mentioned by Haoheng Zhang that really did it properly. After we put out all the locations of the 200 plus structures, that really is the way to go to consider it in a statistically proper manner. And the second question about the disks being inclined or having these elevated scale heights, yes, that was considered. So that's actually what MAPS 4 was with the second paper I worked on, which was exploring the other dimension, the vertical dimension. And particularly for the CO lines, they're actually quite elevated. And you need to take that elevated emission surface from which the emission is coming from to do the deprojection properly to get these radial profiles. It ends up moving around the radial location of substructures, by a few AU. So it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of bulk profile, but it makes a difference if you care the exact location of a particular feature.
Great, thank you very much. There's some more questions, as Alvaro said, but I think we'll put them on Slack, so maybe have a look there, so you can maybe answer them there.
Okay, great, thank you.